Well, here comes a woman with a look in her eye. She's raised on a level, flesh on the mind. Words and weapons, sharpen the knives. Makes you wonder how the other half died. The devil inside, the devil inside. Every single one of us, the devil inside. The devil inside.
In August 1992, Michael Hutchence, the magnetic frontman of INXS and one of the most iconic rock stars of the 1980s, stepped out of a cafe in Copenhagen, Denmark, with his girlfriend, supermodel Helene Christensen. The two had spent the day cycling around the city, enjoying a quiet break from INXS's relentless touring schedule. As they waited for a taxi to return to their hotel, Hutchence got into a heated argument with a local taxi driver. The exact cause of the altercation has never been fully explained, but according to witnesses, it escalated quickly, and the driver suddenly punched Hutchence in the face, causing him to fall to the ground and strike his head on the curb. He lost consciousness, and blood began to pour from his mouth. Paramedics were called, and Hutchence was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors discovered he had a fractured skull. He also sustained damage to his olfactory nerve, which left him with a total loss of smell and much of his sense of taste. Hutchence remained hospitalized for days, and though he survived, he would never be the same. At the time of the injury, he was one of the most famous and charismatic frontmen in the world. INXS had sold tens of millions of albums globally, and their 1987 record, Kick, had catapulted them into the stratosphere with 4 top 10 hits, including Need You Tonight, which hit number 1.
So slide over here and give me a moment. Your moves are so raw. I've got to let you know. I've got to let you know. You are my kind.
The band was everywhere, on magazine covers and red carpets and performing to sold-out stadiums around the world, and Hutchence was the unrivaled star of the show. His tousled curls, smoldering eyes, and seductive stage presence drew comparisons to Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison, but with a raw authenticity that made him a cultural force, rivaling tortured grunge icons like Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder. After the injury, those close to him saw a dramatic change. Christensen later said she watched him transform into someone she no longer fully recognized. Quote, "It was like part of his soul had gone. He was darker, moodier. There was a sadness that he carried from that moment on." Over the next 5 years, Hutchence would spiral slowly and painfully into emotional volatility, deepening depression, substance abuse, and personal chaos. By late 1997, Hutchence was living with his new partner, the British television host Paula Yates, and their 1-year-old daughter named Tiger Lily. But his once glamorous life had grown painfully complicated. Yates was locked in a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband, famed music producer Bob Geldof, over their 3 daughters, to whom Hutchence had grown very close, and the courts had just ruled that the girls could not travel to Sydney for the upcoming Christmas holiday. Friends said the decision left Hutchence devastated, and the ongoing legal war, as well as the media firestorm surrounding it, took a heavy toll on his fragile state of mind. Still, he was trying to press forward. INXS was preparing for its 20th anniversary tour, and for the first 3 weeks of November 1997, he and his band rehearsed in Sydney. The rehearsals reportedly went exceptionally well, and for brief moments he seemed like his old self, cracking jokes, laughing with his bandmates, and flashing that unmistakable charm. But in private, he remained deeply depressed. A friend later said Hutchence seemed, quote, exhausted by something deeper than just stress. On Thursday, November 20th, with Yates in London with Tiger Lily, Hutchence checked into room 524 at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Sydney's exclusive Double Bay neighborhood. Over the next 48 hours, he drank heavily and did all manner of drugs, while placing a series of increasingly emotional and erratic phone calls to family and friends. On the night of November 21st, Hutchence had dinner at the hotel with his father, and then partied in his room with Australian actress Kim Wilson and her boyfriend Andrew Raymond. The 3 drank together and chatted until 4:30 in the morning, when Wilson and Raymond left. What happened next has remained a subject of speculation for nearly 3 decades. What is known is that later that day, November 22nd, 1997, a hotel maid discovered Hutchence. He was naked and on his knees, with one end of a leather belt tied to the automatic door closer and the other wrapped around his neck. Michael Hutchence was just 37 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Michael Hutchence.
In the days and weeks following the death of Michael Hutchence, the public was left with more questions than answers. There was no suicide note, and Australian authorities were tight-lipped. The cause of death was not disclosed pursuant to the country's stringent privacy laws, and all that emerged publicly was the toxicology report, which revealed a troubling cocktail of substances in his system: alcohol, cocaine, codeine, Prozac, Valium, and other benzodiazepines. Beyond that, there was silence. And into that silence poured speculation. The most salacious and persistent rumor was that Michael Hutchence had not intended to kill himself at all, but had died during an act of autoerotic asphyxiation. The theory quickly spread through tabloid headlines and late-night talk shows, fueled by the lack of a suicide note, his reputation as a sexual provocateur, and the bizarre theatrical circumstances of his death. But where did this theory come from? The idea appears to have originated more from inference than evidence. Hutchence was widely known even before his death to be sexually uninhibited, which became a defining part of his public persona. He leaned into it, which only bolstered his reputation as music's most provocative frontman. One anonymous partner told the tabloids after Hutchence's death that he was, quote, extremely sexually adventurous and, quote, always very dominant in bed. And so that reputation, coupled with the manner of death, gave rise to the rumors. And yet, there was no evidence to suggest autoeroticism. No pornography, no bindings, no history of risky sexual behavior involving asphyxiation. Instead, the evidence pointed to a deep-seated depression with which he had long struggled, and which was more recently exacerbated by the physical trauma of his 1992 assault, and the emotional trauma of the custody dispute involving Yates and Geldof. While Hutchence had never attempted suicide before, those closest to him revealed troubling signs. Close friend Michelle Bennett spoke to him just one day before and said that although he had never expressed an inclination to take his own life, she acknowledged he had long battled bouts of depression. That sentiment was echoed by Hutchence's father, Kel, who had dinner with him the night before and said though his son had seemed in good spirits, he was clearly in great distress. Quote, he appeared very worried, his father admitted, but I could offer no explanation as to why he would take his own life.
However, during the death investigation, much of which only came to light in 2018 when the full coroner's report was finally made public, Australian officials uncovered evidence of deeper cracks in Hutchence's mental state. His manager and longtime friend, Martha Troop, disclosed that Hutchence had left her 2 voicemails early on the morning he died, in which he was clearly high and drunk and slurring his words, but that she could make out him saying over and over again, "I fucking had enough." Then, Yates told investigators, Hutchence called her at 5:30 in the morning Australia time, saying he was desperate and was going to call Geldof and beg him to let the children come to Australia. Indeed, Bob Geldof later confirmed he had received 2 phone calls from Hutchence in which he was, quote, hectoring, abusive, and threatening, with Hutchence begging him to let the children visit. And a guest in the adjacent hotel room reported to authorities she'd heard a loud male voice laced with expletives around this time, which was almost certainly Hutchence's final phone call. Taking all this into account, the coroner concluded, quote, on consideration of the entirety of the evidence gathered, I am satisfied that the deceased was in a severe depressed state on the morning of 22 November 1997 due to a number of factors, including the relationship with Paula Yates and the pressure of the ongoing dispute with Sir Robert Geldof, combined with the effects of the substances that he ingested at the time. As indicated, I am satisfied that the deceased intended and did take his own life.
You know, the theory of the autoeroticism is such a large part of the Michael Hutchence story. It is impossible not to also think of the other large, autoerotic asphyxiation death story of David Carradine. And both of them, it was sort of too tempting to not dive into this. David Carradine was considered very weird and offbeat, and so the circumstances of his death were also sort of strange enough that people rushed to that judgment. Michael Hutchence was different because he was such a leading frontman, led with sexuality, INXS. He was so handsome and so out there with his sexuality that people wanted to link it. They wanted to say this is a guy who was kinky and he jerked himself off to death and put a belt around his neck.
So you can't help but compare the two, right? In the case of Carradine, the public was not aware of his social proclivities. Hutchence, people knew about it, but in both cases, the autopsies came out much, much later, the coroner's reports. For Carradine, he was dressed in women's clothing. There was women's clothing laid out on the bed that he was going to prepare to put on later. He had a gold rope tied around his testicles, and that was extended to his neck. Hutchence was more of a simple hanging. He was naked, which brought a lot of this to the fore. But there was no other evidence in Hutchence' case to suggest it. It was just kind of like in the this rule in Australia, right? They didn't release his autopsy report, the full coroner's report, for 20 years. So speculation just fills that void. I think the fact he was naked and had shown these real sexual tendencies prior to that, kind of people just put two and two together and came up with 6. Basically.
Yeah, and the other thing going on is there's this old notion that, you know, a charismatic frontman in the prime of his life, he was 37 years old, still devastatingly handsome, one of the best looking guys on the planet, really.
And extremely charming. He oozed charm and sex appeal.
That's right. And he dated supermodels, Helena Christensen. People wanted to believe that someone who looked like that, who had that type of success in life, had amassed a fortune, dated supermodels, how could he possibly be a depressed individual who would take his own life?
Such an antiquated notion. I mean, it's not that long ago, right? We're talking only in 1997, 27 years ago, but it's a world away in terms of our understanding of mental health and the crippling, we
talk more openly about these things now.
How awful it is to suffer under these sorts of things. And you're right, we talk much more openly. There's a much greater understanding of what people go through, much greater sympathy, and also the fact that we all suffer from some level of mental illness. His was just more profound.
Yeah, and you would hope that now that we speak more openly, people like Michael Hutchence don't have to suffer in shame and silence, because the society was such that if he came out at the time in 1997 and complained about his life in any way or sounded depressed, there would have been a backlash to say, you're rich and famous, how dare you? You have nothing to be sad about. So people turned inward, they turned to drugs, they turned to their depression, and they feel there's no outlet for it. Now it's very openly discussed.
And musicians of all sorts have talked about their mental health. We now see it, obviously athletes now do it in some, in these fields where it was important to be completely stable and you thought of as heroic. You're now able to do what you couldn't do back in 97, which is talk openly about your struggles.
The last thing I want to say about the circumstances of his death is, all that being said, the coroner's report is very, very clear. There are no indication that he died of autoerotic asphyxiation. There's no real mystery here. And yet I believe that the death of Michael Hutchence will continue to contend with this persistent rumor. It's just something that sort of passes from generation to generation. People elide the sort of conclusion of these things, and they race towards the tawdry and sensational.
And also, most people just don't look into it. And so this idea that that's how he died has been sort of just hardened, calcified in people's brains, and they,
it fits for them.
If you listen to the podcast, you learn something about it. I did. I thought there was more evidence of it when I went into researching this podcast than there is. There's frankly no evidence of it.
Yeah.
And that was a surprise to me.
The tragedy isn't only that Hutchence died young. It's that in the years since, his place in music history has not been fully preserved. His legacy has been partially lost to time, to tabloid noise, to changing tastes, and unlike Kurt Cobain or Chester Bennington, fellow frontmen who died young and came to symbolize an entire movement, Hutchence is not often spoken about in the same reverential tones. There are no sprawling murals in his honor and no iconic Rolling Stone covers that capture his legacy. For reasons that are difficult to fully understand, his name is not always mentioned alongside the immortals of his era. Part of this may be due to timing. INXS's peak came before the digital age, before the internet could immortalize moments in real time. Their music, slick, sensual, danceable, didn't neatly fit into the tortured artist narrative that often cements an artist's mythos. Hutchence was complicated, confident but sensitive, stylish but poetic. His appeal wasn't rooted in rebellion or destruction, but in charisma, sex appeal, and deep romanticism. But those who knew him, worked with him, or watched him perform never forgot. Bono once described Hutchence as, quote, a divinely gifted performer and the most beautiful frontman in rock history. Michael Stipe of REM said of him, quote, he could walk into a room and the molecules would shift. He had that thing, that rare thing, true star power. Even Noel Gallagher from Oasis, who was famously cantankerous and dismissive of his peers, admitted that Hutchence, quote, had something no one else had. I saw INXS once, and he owned that stage like Bowie and Jagger rolled into one.
I listened to Kick Again
That's the highest compliment, by the way, for Noel Gallagher to say he really admires
For Noel Gallagher
your
to say anything positive about anybody is a triumph. Just listen to Kick Again. I listened to it a few times or read the lyrics of the songs he wrote. It's easy to find a level, honestly, of a musical genius that sort of stands up with more of his lauded contemporaries. If you listen to Devil Inside, Need You Tonight, New Sensation, they're all great songs. My personal favorite is the ballad Never Tear Us Apart. I don't know when the last time you listened to it, but it's a masterclass in songwriting. I mean, there's sparse lyrics, there's all these dramatic pauses in there that sort of heighten its intensity, and it managed to be both timeless but avoids the cliches that you typically hear in love songs. It's a great song.
I love your precious heart. I was standing, you were there, two worlds collided, and they could never change.
He was a good songwriter. He's an
Yeah.
underrated songwriter. That song in particular is soulful. It's got these intimate vocals that give it a timeless quality. My theory on why Michael Hutchence doesn't occupy the same space is largely what you said. He's not a tortured artist, or it didn't present in that way. He presented as a sex-forward artist, lots of synth vocals. I compare them, we were talking earlier about this, to sort of Duran Duran, extremely important band, a band that had tons of hits. But the legacy of Simon Le Bon is kind of like Michael Hutchence. You know, they are
lost to
charismatic
time.
and they're kind of lost to time.
Yeah.
But in their moments, they are huge. And I think Michael Hutchence, with that sensitivity and those looks, it's impossible to talk about him. When you hear people compare him to Bowie and Jagger, you had to kind of experience the Michael Hutchence effect.
I gotta tell you, I was the perfect age. I was a teenager, middle school, and going to high school when they were at their pinnacle. They were, and it's no exaggeration, the biggest band in the world for about, 18 months or so.
Yeah.
You know, for that 18 months, when Kick came out, it was the biggest band, number one album, a host of number 1 and 2 songs. It was just an incredible album that kind of took over. It was the song, Devil Inside for me was like the song of the summer one summer. You know, it's like everybody listened to it constantly. It was just, but
then grunge came in and it sort of swallowed the world. And it's such a different style that it made the Michael Hutchences and the INXSs of the world seem passé more quickly than they would have otherwise.
Kick was INXS's most successful album, as we said. It was multi-platinum, critically acclaimed, and packed with international hits that defined late 80s pop rock. But it was far from the end of Hutchenson's creative peak. As the band's lead vocalist and primary lyricist, Hutchence continued to deliver hit after hit well into the 1990s, crafting songs that showed off both his emotional depth and star power. Following Kick, the band released the album X in 1990 with the songs Suicide Blonde and Disappear, and then 1992's Welcome to Wherever You Are revealed a far more introspective, experimental Hutchence with the hits A Straight Line and Slide Away, which he sang with Bono. Let's go back for a second to Suicide Blonde. Hutchence wrote it about his then-girlfriend, Kylie Minogue. Suicide Blonde, I guess she had come out with her hair dyed platinum. It's a movie premiere. There's the famous lyrics from the song, Suicide Blonde died by her own hand, because I guess she did it in the sink before going out to a movie premiere, which is so risky. But
you get the double entendre, right? Died by her own hand. He was a really gifted songwriter.
Yeah, exactly. But his relationship with Minogue is just one of a string of high-profile romances. He was stunning, and he had relationships with all these stunning women. We talked about Kylie Minogue, who's dropped it gorgeous even to this day. Helena Christensen, supermodel. Go-Go's lead singer, Belinda Carlisle, who was my number one when I was 13 years old.
Everyone wanted to date Belinda.
The actress Virginia Hay, and a slew of other really renowned beauties. He just had a well-earned reputation as quite the Lothario.
Yeah, he looked like he had it all. From the outside,
the Justin Timberlake of his day.
That's right. That's exactly right. But it seems that every one of Hutchence's relationships were defined by their intensity and turbulence. His relationship with Kylie Minogue, for example, began as a whirlwind and transformed her public image, but it ended with heartbreak. Minogue described him as, quote, a broken man searching for peace. And as we've seen, Helena Christensen said that after the 1992 injury in Denmark, an already temperamental Hutchence became even more emotionally volatile. Hutchence wasn't the type to engage in casual flings. His romantic entanglements tended to be all-consuming and deeply entwined with his artistic temperament. But his most tumultuous and publicly scrutinized relationship, and the one that would be his undoing, was with Paula Yates. Their affair ignited while Hutchence was still with Christensen, and Yates was married to Bob Geldof, after Yates interviewed him on her Big Breakfast television show. The conceit of the show was that Yates would lay in bed with her subjects and lightly flirt while asking probing questions. But with Hutchence, it was different. Yates did the interview with her legs draped over Hutchence's body, and their repartee went far beyond casual flirtation. The segment was drenched in sexual tension and aired to millions, effectively announcing their chemistry to the world. In the months that followed, their relationship was on the front page of the British tabloids for months. When shortly thereafter Yates left Geldof, Hutchence was cast as the home-wrecking rock star, while Yates was vilified in the press, and the couple's every move, including the years of ensuing custody battles, led to paparazzi chases and legal threats that were splashed across the front pages. What had started as a moment of playful intimacy on morning TV quickly devolved into a chaotic, high-stakes public drama that would haunt Hutchence for the rest of his life, and as we have seen, would ultimately be his undoing.
In the end, Michael Hutchence's death left behind a quiet sense of loss. As a frontman, he possessed rare talent, both a lyrical mind and a magnetic stage presence. He was a figure of contrast, confident yet sensitive, and outwardly charming yet always introspective. Yet, for someone celebrated by millions, there was a disconnect between his public perception and private struggle. In the years since, his artistic legacy has sometimes been overshadowed by tabloid headlines and the circumstances of his death, but to those who knew him, worked with him, or were moved by his voice, Hutchence remains a tragic figure. He was a genuine artist, one whose talent and presence continued to resonate, but who simply could never outrun the effects of his trauma. Hutchence's longtime friend and collaborator, Bono, said of him, quote, "He was a beautiful, poetic soul. There was a fragility to Michael, a vulnerability that was very attractive, but it was also a wound that never really healed. He had all the ingredients to be one of the greats. He was one of the greats, but the world didn't know what to do with someone like him. He was a sensualist, a thinker, a rock star who also read poetry. That's not a combination the world handles well, and I think the weight of being so adored but still feeling isolated, that's what eventually crushed him."